My name is Samantha, and at 28, I thought I had a perfect marriage of 5 years with Eric, until that night at his father Harold's birthday party. One spilled glass of wine changed everything. The moment the red liquid splashed on his crisp white shirt, I saw a side of my father-in-law I never imagined. But what hurt more than his fist connecting with my face was hearing my husband say those words that shattered our marriage. If you're watching this, drop a comment letting me know where you're from. Hit that subscribe button and stay with me through this journey of heartbreak and healing. I grew up in a middle-class neighborhood in Columbus, Ohio. My parents were hard-working people who taught me the value of education and independence. Dad was an accountant, Mom, a high school English teacher. We never had luxury, but we had love in abundance. They supported me through college, where I earned my degree in graphic design, always encouraging my creative talents. After graduation, I landed a job at a small marketing agency. The pay wasn't amazing, but I loved the creative freedom. It was at this point in my life, feeling confident and settled in my career path, that I met Eric. It happened at my friend Jenna's art gallery opening. I was admiring a particularly striking abstract piece when a tall, dark-haired man with kind eyes offered me a glass of champagne. That was Eric. He was charming, intelligent, and seemed genuinely interested in my opinions about the artwork. We talked for hours that night, exchanging numbers as the gallery was closing. Our relationship progressed quickly. Eric worked as a financial analyst at a prestigious firm. He was ambitious and hard-working, but also attentive and romantic. Within 6 months, we were inseparable. After a year, he proposed during a weekend trip to Lake Erie. I said yes, without hesitation, believing I had found my perfect partner. The first cracks appeared when I met his family, particularly his father Harold. Harold Carson was a self-made millionaire who had built a successful chain of luxury car dealerships across the Midwest. He lived in a mansion in the most exclusive suburb of the city, had a collection of vintage cars, and made sure everyone knew about his success story. From our first meeting, Harold assessed me like I was a business acquisition rather than his son's fiancée. His handshake was firm to the point of being painful, his smile never reaching his eyes. "So you draw pictures for a living," he said, reducing my career to a child's hobby in one dismissive sentence. Eric had warned me that his father was old-fashioned and had high expectations, but nothing prepared me for the subtle barrage of put-downs that characterized every interaction with Harold. He questioned my career choice. "Not much money in that, is there? My background, no family connections in the industry, and even my appearance. You'd look more professional with shorter hair." What troubled me more than Harold's behavior was Eric's response to it. Around his father, my confident, loving boyfriend transformed into an anxious people-pleaser. He laughed too loudly at Harold's jokes, agreed with his opinions, even when I knew he thought differently, and worst of all, never defended me against his father's subtle jabs. "That's just Dad's way," Eric would explain after particularly uncomfortable dinners. "He's tough on everyone. It means he's interested in you." As our wedding approached, I met more of Eric's family. His mother Diana seemed kind, but perpetually anxious, always deferring to Harold's opinions and preferences. His sister Allison was warm toward me when her father wasn't around, but became distant in his presence. His younger brother James barely spoke, his eyes constantly seeking Harold's approval. The wedding was lavish, mostly planned according to Harold's vision rather than ours. I compromised on almost everything to keep the peace, telling myself it was just one day. What mattered was our life together afterward. But married life didn't create the boundary I had hoped for. Harold expected Sunday dinners at his house, called Eric at all hours, with business advice, and criticized our decisions from where we lived to how we invested our savings. Eric always gave in, explaining that his father only wanted the best for us. The pattern continued for 5 years. Each time Harold belittled my career achievements, questioned our decision not to have children yet, or made suggestions about how I should dress or behave, Eric would either remain silent or actively agree with his father. Each time I swallowed my hurt, trying to be the perfect wife and daughter-in-law, believing that eventually I would earn Harold's respect. There were bright spots when it was just Eric and me. Away from his father's influence, he was still the man I fell in love with. We traveled, built our careers, made friends with other couples. But increasingly, Harold's shadow fell across our happiness. Arguments about his influence became more frequent. "You don't understand the pressure," Eric would say. "He sacrificed everything for us growing up." By the time Harold's 65th birthday approached, the strain was showing in our marriage. Eric was working longer hours at the firm, where Harold had put in a good word for him. I was increasingly successful in my own career, having been promoted to creative director at a larger agency, a fact that seemed to irritate Harold even more. "Dad's birthday is really important," Eric emphasized as the date approached. "Everyone who matters in the city will be there. We need to make a good impression." I nodded, already dreading the event, but knowing how much it meant to Eric. Little did I know that night would change everything. The invitation to Harold's 65th birthday celebration wasn't really an invitation, but an expectation. Delivered on thick cream cardstock with gold embossing, it specified black tie, and included a note that gifts were welcomed but not expected, which everyone understood meant gifts were absolutely expected and would be judged accordingly. "We need to get him something special," Eric insisted, scrolling through websites selling luxury watches. "Last year, James got him those golf clubs, and Dad still talks about it." We ended up spending $3,000 on a rare vintage whiskey that Eric assured me his father would appreciate. It was money we had been saving for a vacation, but I bit my tongue. This battle wasn't worth fighting. The night of the party, I spent hours getting ready. My dress was new, a floor-length navy blue gown that cost more than I would normally spend, but I knew appearance mattered at these events. I styled my hair in an elegant updo, applied my makeup carefully, and put on the pearl necklace Eric had given me for our anniversary. "You look beautiful," Eric said, adjusting his bow tie in the mirror. But I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he checked his watch repeatedly. Remember, Dad appreciates punctuality. We arrived at Harold's mansion precisely 30 minutes after the start time listed on the invitation. Not too early to seem eager, not late enough to be disrespectful, Eric had calculated. The house was lit up spectacularly, with valets, parking cars, and staff taking coats at the door. Harold's home was a monument to his success. The grand entrance hall featured a crystal chandelier and a sweeping staircase. The walls were adorned with expensive artwork that I suspected he chose for their price tags rather than any genuine appreciation. Fresh flower arrangements larger than some apartments I'd lived in dominated every surface. "Eric, Samantha, you made it." Harold appeared drink in hand, looking distinguished in his tuxedo. At 65, he was still fit and imposing, his silver hair perfectly styled, his posture military straight. He clapped Eric on the shoulder and offered me a perfunctory air kiss near my cheek. "Diana was wondering if you'd be on time." "Happy birthday, Dad," Eric said, handing over our elaborately wrapped gift. "We wouldn't miss it." Harold barely glanced at the package before passing it to a waiting staff member. "Put this with the others. Would you? Come along, the Richardsons. Just arrived. They've been asking about you, Eric. Thomas is expanding his hedge fund. Might be some opportunities there." As Harold led Eric away, I found myself alone in a sea of strangers. This was typical. Harold would separate us immediately, parading Eric before his business associates, while I was left to fend for myself. I made my way to the bar, requesting a glass of white wine, then circulated slowly around the edge of the grand ballroom. Eventually, I spotted Diana Harold's wife of 40 years. She was engaged in conversation with a group of women wearing what appeared to be competing diamonds. Diana herself was dressed impeccably in a silver gown, her thin frame suggesting fragility, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. "Samantha, dear," she said, when she noticed me, her voice carrying the faint trace of the southern accent she had never fully lost. "You look lovely. Have you been enjoying the party?" Before I could answer, one of the women interrupted with a question about the caterer, and Diana was pulled back into their conversation. I excused myself, continuing my circuit of the room. The party was populated by Harold's business associates, country club friends, and various local dignitaries he had cultivated relationships with. In a corner, I spotted Eric's sister Allison looking uncomfortable in a conversation with an older couple. Allison worked as an environmental lawyer, a career choice Harold barely acknowledged since it didn't align with his values of wealth accumulation. "Rescue me," she whispered when I approached, introducing me to the couple before finding an excuse for us to step away. "These parties get worse every year. Have you been cornered by Dad yet?" "Not yet. He's busy showing Eric off to the Richardsons." Allison rolled her eyes. "Poor Eric. Still trying to be the perfect son after all these years." She lowered her voice. "James isn't even coming tonight. Told Dad he had a business trip, but really he's at home with his boyfriend. Can't face another lecture about settling down with the right girl." This was news to me. Eric had never mentioned his brother might be gay, though it explained some of James's discomfort at family gatherings. "Harold doesn't know—" "Harold sees what he wants to see," Allison replied, sipping her champagne. "Speaking of which, brace yourself. He's heading this way and looking determined." Harold approached, now flanked by Eric and a portly man with ruddy cheeks. "Allison, there you are. Judge Wilson has been asking about your environmental case, the one against the power company." His tone made it clear he found the topic distasteful. "And Samantha, Eric tells me your little design firm won some kind of award." "My agency won the Regional Advertising Excellence Award for our campaign with the Children's Hospital," I corrected gently. It had been a major achievement, one I was genuinely proud of. Harold made a dismissive noise. "Well, it's nice to have hobbies. Eric here is being considered for the junior partner track, aren't you, son? Thomas thinks he has real potential." Eric beamed under his father's rare praise, not noticing or choosing to ignore the way he had diminished my accomplishment. I felt my cheeks flush but maintained my smile, having learned that showing any negative reaction only made these situations worse. As the evening progressed, I found myself becoming increasingly tense. Every interaction with Harold felt like navigating a minefield. The wine I was drinking to cope was hitting harder than expected, probably because I'd been too nervous to eat much of the elaborate food being served by white-gloved staff. I observed Harold throughout the night, noting how differently he treated people based on their perceived value to him. He was charming and attentive to business contacts and local officials, condescending to service staff, and alternately controlling or dismissive with his family. I watched as he criticized the way Diana was conversing. With the mayor's wife, saw him pull Eric aside repeatedly to introduce him to important contacts, and noticed how he barely acknowledged Allison's significant other when they arrived late. The final straw came during the dinner portion of the evening. We were seated at an elaborate table in the mansion's formal dining room, Harold at the head holding court. The conversation had turned to politics, with Harold expressing strong opinions about recent tax legislation. "These social programs are just handouts," he declared, gesturing with his fork. "When I started my business, I didn't get any government help, worked 18-hour days, took risks. That's how you build success." I knew from Eric that Harold's first dealership had actually been purchased with a significant loan from his own father-in-law, but no one at the table contradicted him. "What do you think?" Samantha Harold suddenly asked, fixing me with his penetrating stare. "You work in a creative field. I imagine many of your colleagues support these entitlement programs." All eyes turned to me. Eric tensed beside me, his hand finding mine under the table in what might have been support or warning. I took a deep breath, knowing I was being baited but unwilling to completely compromise my values. "I think different people have different circumstances," I said carefully. "Not everyone has the same opportunities or starting advantages. Safety nets help people through difficult times so they can contribute to society later." The table fell uncomfortably silent. Harold's eyes narrowed slightly before he let out a laugh that didn't sound amused. "Well, that's a very idealistic perspective. When you've been in business as long as I have, you learn how the world really works." The conversation moved on, but I could feel Harold's disapproval like a physical weight. Eric's hand had withdrawn from mine. I reached for my wine glass, needing something to occupy my hands and calm my nerves. The red liquid gleamed under the chandelier, light, dark, and rich against the white tablecloth. Little did I know that this glass of wine would become the catalyst for the unraveling of my marriage. As dinner concluded, servers began clearing plates and refreshing drinks. The large dining room hummed with conversation, crystal glasses clinked, and occasional bursts of laughter punctuated the evening air. Harold had moved to stand at the head of the table, preparing to give what I assumed would be one of his self-congratulatory speeches before the cake was presented. I had managed to survive most of the evening without any major confrontations, keeping my responses neutral and my smile fixed in place. The wine had helped dull the edge of anxiety, though I was careful not to drink too much. The last thing I needed was to give Harold ammunition about my inappropriate behavior. Eric had been by my side physically throughout dinner, but emotionally distant, constantly scanning his father's reactions and adjusting his own accordingly. I felt exhausted by the performance of it all, the constant vigilance required to navigate Harold's expectations. As Harold tapped his glass for attention, I noticed several servers entering with trays of fresh drinks for the toast. One approached me, offering a new glass of red wine. I accepted it with a whispered thank you, earning a genuine smile from the young woman. Harold noticed this exchange and frowned slightly before beginning his speech. "Friends, colleagues, family," he began, his voice commanding the room instantly. "Thank you for joining me to celebrate 65 years of life and success. When I look around this room, I see the fruits of decades of hard work and determination." He continued in this vein, recounting his business triumphs, thanking key people who had supported his vision, and making several jokes at the expense of competitors who had failed where he had succeeded. The guests laughed appreciatively, raising their glasses at appropriate moments. "And of course, family is the foundation of success," Harold eventually said, gesturing toward Diana, who smiled tightly. "My wife has been the backbone of our home, allowing me to focus on building our legacy." He then nodded toward Eric. "And my son is following in my footsteps, showing the same drive and business acumen, already making waves at Richardson Financial." Allison received a brief mention for her interesting legal work, though Harold managed to make it sound like a quirky hobby rather than a successful career fighting corporate polluters. I noticed her jaw tighten, her partner squeezing her hand under the table. Then Harold's gaze landed on me, and Eric's wife, Samantha, who creates those advertisements and posters. A creative spirit in our family of business people. There was a dismissive chuckle in his voice, the implication clear that my work was trivial compared to the important financial dealings of the men in the family. I felt my face flush with humiliation and anger. My advertisements and posters had won industry awards and increased client revenue by millions. My agency's work had helped raise significant funds for children's cancer research. Yet Harold consistently reduced my career to a child's pastime. As the speech continued, I found myself growing increasingly tense. My fingers gripped the wine glass stem too tightly, and I forced myself to relax them. Eric must have sensed my discomfort because he leaned over and whispered, "Just smile through it. You know how he gets on his birthday." But something in me had reached a breaking point. 5 years of diminishment of watching my husband shrink in his father's presence, of compromising my own values and dignity to keep peace in a family that would never truly accept me. The pressure had been building, and Harold's dismissive comment about my career was the final straw. As Harold concluded his speech to applause and raised glasses, he made direct eye contact with me across the table. There was something challenging in his gaze, as if daring me to contradict his narrative of family harmony. "And now," he said, still looking at me, "I hope my daughter-in-law will make an effort to fit more fully into the Carson family traditions in the coming year. Perhaps focus more on creating a family of your own, rather than those little drawings." The comment landed like a slap. Eric and I had decided together to wait on having children until our careers were more established. It was a private decision that Harold had no right to comment on publicly. Several guests looked uncomfortable, glancing away, or suddenly finding their dessert fascinating. I stood up abruptly, intending to excuse myself to the bathroom before I said something I would regret. In my haste and emotional state, I misjudged the distance between myself and the neighboring chair. My hip bumped the table and I lost my grip on the wineglass. Time seemed to slow down. I watched in horror as the glass tipped the dark red liquid arcing through the air in what seemed like slow motion. Harold had moved around the table during his speech and was now standing barely 2 feet from me. The wine splashed directly onto his pristine white tuxedo shirt and black jacket, creating an explosion of crimson across his chest. The room fell deadly silent. Harold looked down at his stained shirt, then up at me, his face transforming from shock to rage in seconds. His eyes, so similar to Eric's, but lacking any warmth, narrowed to slits. "You clumsy, disrespectful." He began, his voice low and dangerous. "I'm so sorry," I gasped, grabbing a napkin and instinctively moving to help clean the spill. "It was an accident, What happened next occurred so quickly, I barely had time to process it. Harold's right hand swung upward and connected with my face in an open-handed slap that felt more like a punch. The force of it snapped my head to the side and sent me stumbling backward. I tasted blood immediately, my lips split against my teeth. The pain was shocking, radiating through my jaw and cheek. I raised my hand to my face, feeling warm liquid on my fingers. Blood dripped from my lip onto the polished floor, bright red droplets on the expensive marble. Harold Diana's horrified voice broke the stunned silence. But Harold wasn't finished. His face contorted with a rage that seemed out of proportion to the accident. "You stupid maid," he shouted, though I had never been a maid in my life. It was as if he was revealing how he truly saw me, as the help, not family. "Look what you've done. This shirt cost more than you probably make in a week. Go wash it now." I stood, frozen blood still dripping from my lip, unable to believe what had just happened. My eyes sought Eric, desperately looking for my husband to defend me, to be outraged on my behalf, to stand up to his father at last. Eric had risen from his chair, his face pale with shock. For one hopeful moment, I thought he was moving to stand between me and his father, to protect me. Instead, he stopped, his eyes darting between Harold's enraged face and my bleeding one. I could see the conflict in him, the lifetime of conditioning battling against what he must know was right. "Eric," I whispered, my voice cracking with pain and betrayal. Harold adjusted his stained jacket, his momentary loss of control giving way to cold fury. "Control your wife, Eric. This behavior is unacceptable in my home." All eyes in the room were on Eric now. His business associates, his mother, his sister, the serving staff, everyone waiting to see what he would do. I saw him swallow hard, his Adam's apple bobbing as he made his choice. "Samantha," he said, his voice strained, but clear in the silent room. "You should apologize to my father." It felt like the floor had disappeared beneath my feet. What I managed tasting blood as I spoke. Eric wouldn't meet my eyes. "Just apologize for the accident. Or you should get out." The words hung in the air between us, irrevocable. In that moment, something fundamental broke inside me. Not just my heart, but my understanding of who we were, together, who I thought my husband was. Blood continued to drip from my split lip, dotting the floor with tiny red circles. No one moved to help me, to offer a cloth for my bleeding mouth, or to express concern for my injury. In their silence, they were all complicit. I straightened my spine, using the back of my hand to wipe blood from my chin. Without a word, I turned and walked toward the door, my heels clicking on the marble floor in the deathly quiet room. I didn't look back at Eric, at Harold, or at any of the shocked faces of the guests. My cheek throbbed, my lip stung, but the pain of betrayal eclipsed any physical discomfort. As I reached the grand foyer, I heard Allison call my name, but I didn't stop. I collected my wrap and purse from the coat check and walked out into the cool night air alone. The night air hit my face like a second slap, the cool breeze stinging my split lip. For a moment I stood on the sweeping driveway of Harold's mansion, disoriented and in shock. My mind struggled to process what had just happened, to reconcile the physical violence with the man who had hosted 40 guests in his home, to understand how my husband could choose his father over me after witnessing such an assault. A valet approached, concern evident on his young face. "Ma'am, are you all right? Do you need medical assistance?" I must have looked a sight. An elegantly dressed woman, with blood on her face and hands, standing alone outside a mansion where a birthday celebration continued as if nothing had happened. "My car, please." I managed to say, my voice steadier than I felt. "The black Audi." "Of course, right away." He hurried off, speaking quickly into his radio. I stood there, acutely aware of my heartbeat pounding in my ears. Inside that house was the man I had promised to love for a lifetime, the man whose ring I wore, whose name I had taken, whose life I had entwined with mine. And he had just told me to apologize to someone who had struck me hard enough to draw blood or to leave. As if these were equivalent options. As if I had done something to deserve violence. A tissue appeared in my peripheral vision. Another valet, this one older, was offering me a clean handkerchief. "For your lip, ma'am," he said quietly. "Thank you," I whispered, pressing it gently to my mouth. The white cloth immediately bloomed with red. My car arrived and the first valet opened the door for me. "Are you sure you should be driving? We could call you a taxi." "I'm fine," I said automatically, though. I was anything but fine. I just needed to get away, to put distance between myself and the Carson family. As I slid into the driver's seat, I caught a glimpse of my face in the rearview mirror. My carefully applied makeup was smeared, my lower lip swollen and split on one side, a bruise already forming on my left cheek. 5 years of marriage, of compromises, of trying to fit into the Carson family mold, and this was where it had led me, bleeding and alone, in a car outside my father-in-law's mansion. I started the engine, and drove carefully down the long driveway, past manicured gardens and ornamental fountains that had cost more than most people's homes. At the security gate, the guard nodded, politely seemingly unaware of what had transpired inside. Perhaps such incidents weren't uncommon in Harold's world. Once on the main road, I had no clear destination in mind. I couldn't face going back to the house Eric and I shared not yet. The thought of waiting there surrounded by our wedding photos and shared possessions for a husband who had just publicly betrayed me was unbearable. Tears blurred my vision as I drove aimlessly through the upscale neighborhood. I pulled over on a quiet side street, not trusting myself to drive safely in my emotional state. Sobs welled up from deep inside me, breaking through the shock. I cried for the humiliation I had endured, for the pain of Eric's betrayal, and for the realization that perhaps our entire marriage had been built on illusions. My phone began to ring in my purse. Eric's name flashed on the screen. I let it go to voicemail. It rang again immediately, and again. I silenced it, unable to hear his voice, to listen to whatever explanation or justification he might offer. After composing myself enough to drive safely, I made a decision. I needed neutral ground, a place to think and plan my next steps. I drove to a hotel near the city center, one nice enough to be safe, but not so upscale that my disheveled appearance would cause too much concern. The night clerk at the reception desk looked up as I approached, his professional smile faltering slightly at the sight of my face. "Good evening, ma'am. How can I help you?" "I need a room for tonight," I said, reaching for my credit card. "Just one night." His eyes flickered to my injured lip, but professionally avoided commenting. "Of course. May I see some identification?" As I handed over my driver's license and credit card, I was acutely aware of how this must look. A woman with a bruised face checking into a hotel alone late at night. The clerk processed my information with discreet efficiency. "Room 412, he said, handing me a key card. "The elevators are to your right. Is there anything else you need?" I understood what he was really asking. "No, thank you. I'm safe now." I said the words catching in my throat, because they highlighted the fact that I hadn't been safe in Harold's home with my own husband. The hotel room was bland and impersonal, but it represented sanctuary. I locked the door behind me, engaged the security chain, and finally allowed myself to fully feel the magnitude of what had happened. In the bathroom, I carefully cleaned my split lip with warm water, wincing at the sting. The bruise on my cheek was darkening, a visible reminder of Harold's violence and Eric's failure to protect me. I changed out of my expensive gown into the hotel's complimentary robe, the formal dress now feeling like a costume from a life that no longer existed. My phone continued to light up with notifications. 10 missed calls from Eric, 3 from Allison, text messages I couldn't bring myself to read. I set the phone to Do Not Disturb, but not before seeing a text preview from Eric. "Please come home. We need to talk about..." Talk about what? About how his father had physically assaulted me and he had done nothing, about how he had prioritized Harold's stained shirt over my bleeding face, about how 5 years of marriage meant less to him than his father's approval. I sat on the edge of the hotel bed, my mind replaying the evening's events on loop. Had there been signs I'd ignored? Yes, countless times, when Eric had chosen his father's wishes over our own, when he had remained silent in the face of Harold's criticism, when he had asked me to compromise just this once, to keep the peace. But I had never imagined he would fail me, so completely, so publicly. The Eric I thought I knew would never allow anyone to hurt me, would stand between me and danger without hesitation. Who was this stranger who had told me to apologize to my attacker or leave? By dawn, I had barely slept. My face throbbed and my heart felt hollowed out. I checked my phone to find 36 missed calls. 23 from Eric, 8 from Allison, 3 from my friend Rachel, and 2 from numbers I didn't recognize. The volume of messages suggested the news had spread beyond those present at the party. I couldn't face any of them yet. I needed time to think to decide what this meant for my marriage, my future. I ordered room service breakfast I couldn't eat and stared out the window at the awakening city below, feeling disconnected from the normal world continuing outside. Around 9 in the morning, I called Rachel, my closest friend since college. She answered on the first ring. "Samantha, oh my God, are you okay? Allison called me looking for you. She told me what happened. Where are you?" Hearing her voice filled with genuine concern broke something in me. "He hit me, Rachel," I said, my voice cracking. "Harold hit me, and Eric. Eric told me to apologize to him." "Jesus Christ," Rachel breathed. "Where are you now? I'm coming to get you." I gave her the hotel information, grateful beyond words for her immediate, unquestioning support. Within 45 minutes, she was knocking on my door, gasping when she saw my face. "That bastard," she said, pulling me into a gentle hug. "Both of them, bastards." Rachel helped me gather my few belongings. "You're coming to stay with me," she said in a tone that brooked no argument. "For as long as you need." As we left the hotel, I made a decision that would alter the course of my life. I wasn't going back. Not to Eric. Not to a marriage where I came second to an abusive father-in-law. Not to a relationship built on such a fundamental betrayal of trust. It wasn't a decision made in anger or haste, despite the freshness of the wounds. It was a moment of clarity, of recognizing that some lines once crossed cannot be uncrossed. A man who could watch his wife be struck and bleeding and choose the aggressor's side was not a man I could build a life with. As Rachel drove us to her apartment, I looked out at the passing city streets. The same buildings as yesterday, but everything had changed. I had changed. And there was no going back. Rachel's guest room became my sanctuary for the next week. It was a small space with a twin bed, a desk, and a window overlooking a quiet side street, but it represented safety and unconditional support. Rachel lived alone in a 2-bedroom apartment in a diverse, artistic neighborhood across town from the suburban home Eric and I had shared. The change of environment helped clear my head. The morning after the incident, I woke to find my face significantly more swollen, the bruise on my cheek having darkened to a deep purple that no concealer could hide. My split lip was crusted with dried blood, painful when I spoke or tried to eat. Rachel took photos for documentation, though I wasn't ready to think about what kind of documentation I might need. My phone continued to accumulate missed calls and messages. Eric's texts evolved from confused. "Where are you? Please come home so we can talk about this," to angry. "You're overreacting." Dad was out of line, but so were you. To pleading, "Please, Sam, I love you. We can work through this." I read them all, but responded to none. Allison's messages were different, full of apologies and concern. What Dad did was inexcusable. "I should have done more. Please let me know you're safe." I finally sent her a brief text, letting her know I was staying with a friend and was physically okay. On the third day, Rachel convinced me to see a doctor. "You need to have that documented properly," she insisted, "and make sure nothing's broken." The urgent care physician examined my face with clinical detachment. "Significant contusion to the left zygomatic arch," she noted. "Laceration to the lower lip, approximately 1 centimeter. Consistent with blunt force trauma." She looked up from her tablet. "Miss Carson, would you like resources for domestic violence victims?" The question startled me. I had been thinking of the incident as a singular event, a terrible night that had revealed the truth about my marriage. But hearing it described as domestic violence shifted something in my perception. This wasn't just about a father-in-law losing his temper or a husband failing to defend me. This was about entering a family system where violence was an acceptable response to a spilled drink. Yes, I said after a moment. I would like those resources. That afternoon I called my parents. I had been avoiding it, knowing how worried they would be, how my father would likely want to confront Harold and Eric directly, but I needed their support. My mother answered, her voice brightening when she recognized mine. Samantha, how was the big birthday party? Your father and I were just talking about calling you. I broke down then, the facade of coping crumbling at the sound of my mother's voice. Through tears, I explained what had happened, trying to stick to the facts without emotional embellishment. There was a long silence when I finished. We're coming, my mother said, her voice tight with controlled anger. Pack what you need. You're coming home with us. Mom, you don't need to come all the way here. I'm safe at Rachel's. Samantha Jean, she said, using my middle name as she always did when deadly serious. Your father and I are getting in the car right now. We'll be there by dinner time. This is not negotiable. True to their word, my parents arrived at Rachel's apartment 6 hours later, having driven straight from Columbus. My mother gasped when she saw my face, tears filling her eyes. My father, usually so gentle and measured, looked like he might drive straight to Harold's mansion. I'll kill him, he said, his hands shaking with rage. I'll kill them both. Dad, no, I said firmly. That's not why I called you. I need support, not more violence. We spent that evening making plans. My parents wanted me to return to Ohio with them, at least temporarily. Give yourself space to think, my mother advised. Away from Eric's influence and pressure. The next day, Rachel and my parents helped me collect essential items from the house while Eric was at work. It felt surreal entering what had been my home for 5 years, with my father standing guard at the door as if expecting Eric to appear. I packed clothes, personal documents, my laptop, and a few sentimental items that were solely mine. I left my wedding ring on the dresser. Before leaving town with my parents, I made 2 important calls. The first was to a therapist recommended by the Domestic Violence Resources. The second was to a lawyer. The therapist, Dr. Lawson, spoke with me briefly on the phone. What you're experiencing is trauma, she said, both from the physical assault and from your husband's betrayal. These kinds of events can shatter our assumptions about safety and trust. I have an opening next Tuesday if you'd like to come in. The lawyer was direct and practical. Document everything, she advised. The medical report, photographs of your injuries, any text messages or emails that refer to the incident. Don't delete anything, even if Eric apologizes or tries to minimize what happened. When I asked about divorce, she was neither encouraging nor discouraging. That's a personal decision. I can tell you that in my experience, physical violence rarely occurs in isolation. It's usually part of a pattern, even if this is the first time it's manifested this way. As I settled into my childhood bedroom in my parents' home, I had time to reflect on that pattern. Harold had never been physically violent in my presence before, but the seeds had been there. In his controlling behavior, his explosive anger over minor issues, his treatment of service staff, and the way Diana flinched slightly when he raised his voice. And Eric. I scrolled through mental images of our marriage, seeing now what I had chosen to ignore. How he became anxious before visits, with his father checking and rechecking details to avoid Harold's criticism. How he would agree with Harold's offensive opinions, then later tell me he didn't really believe them. How he had gradually pushed me to change aspects of myself, my appearance, my career ambitions, even my political views, to better align with Harold's expectations. 2 weeks after leaving, I finally agreed to meet Eric at a neutral location, a coffee shop downtown. He was already waiting when I arrived, rising quickly when he saw me. The bruise on my face had faded to a yellowish shadow, but my lips still showed a visible healing cut. "Sam," he said, his voice breaking, "thank you for meeting me. I've been so worried." I sat across from him, maintaining physical distance. Up close, he looked terrible. Unshaven, dark circles under his eyes, a certain desperate energy about him. Part of me ached to comfort him, to fall back into the familiar pattern of managing his emotional needs. I resisted the urge. "I'm staying with my parents," I said evenly. I needed space to think. "I understand," he said quickly. "What happened was awful. Dad was completely out of line. He's never done anything like that before, I swear. He was drunk and under stress about some business deal." "Stop," I interrupted. "Are you actually making excuses for him hitting me?" Eric looked down at his coffee. "No, of course not. It was inexcusable. He knows that. He wants to apologize in person." The idea of facing Harold again made my stomach turn. I don't want his apology. What I wanted was for my husband to defend me, to choose me, to be outraged that someone hurt me. Instead, you told me to apologize to him. "I was in shock," Eric pleaded. "You don't understand what it's like with him. Growing up, we never challenged Dad. Ever. He has a temper. When Mom would try to stand up to him, things would get worse." I felt a chill. Worse how? Eric's silence told me everything. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was a pattern of behavior I was only now seeing clearly. "Did he hit your mother, your siblings?" "It wasn't like that," Eric said defensively. "Dad believes in discipline, old school, you know. A few times when I was a teenager, things got physical, but he's mellowed with age." "Not mellowed enough, clearly. Eric, listen to yourself. You're normalizing abuse." "It's not abuse," he insisted, though his eyes wouldn't meet mine. "Dad built everything from nothing. He had it tough growing up. He doesn't know how to express himself sometimes." We talked for over an hour, going in circles. Eric alternated between acknowledging his father's behavior was wrong and making excuses for it. He promised things would be different, that he would set boundaries with Harold, that we could start fresh. "I love you, Sam. Please come home." "On what conditions?" I asked. "Would I still be expected to see Harold at family events? Would you actually stand up to him next time? Or would I be on my own again?" Eric hesitated, and in that hesitation was my answer. He couldn't promise to choose me over his father, not really. The programming ran too deep. "I need more time," I said finally. "And I have some non-negotiable conditions if there's any chance for us. First, I will never be in Harold's presence again. Second, we start couples therapy immediately. Third, you begin individual therapy to address your relationship with your father." Eric looked stricken. "Never see Dad again. That's not practical, Sam. He's my father. There are holidays, family events." "Then you have your answer," I said quietly. "And so do I." I left the coffee shop, feeling strangely calm. The decision had been made, not in the heat of the moment, but after careful reflection. I filed for legal separation the next day. In the months that followed, I rebuilt my life piece by piece. I found a job at a different marketing agency in my hometown. I rented a small apartment, furnished it with items that were solely mine, decorated it according to my own taste rather than the neutral palette Eric had preferred. I continued therapy, working through not just the trauma of that night, but the slow erosion of self that had occurred throughout my marriage, Doctor. Lawson helped me recognize the red flags. I had ignored the compromises that had gone beyond normal relationship give and take into self-abandonment. The physical violence was the breaking point, she observed, during one session, but the foundation had been cracking for years. She was right. In trying to please Eric, and by extension Harold, I had gradually silenced my own voice, doubted my own perceptions, and accepted treatment I would never have tolerated in the beginning of our relationship. 3 months after our separation, I filed for divorce. Eric contested it initially, still believing we could reconcile. But eventually, seeing my resolve, he agreed to an uncontested dissolution. We divided our assets equitably, the process made easier by the fact that we had no children. The day I signed the final divorce papers, I felt a complex mix of grief and liberation. 5 years of my life had been invested in a relationship that had ultimately failed. Yet, I was free now. Free from Harold's influence. Free from Eric's inability to be the partner I needed. Free to rebuild on my own terms. That evening, I received an unexpected call from Allison. "I heard the divorce was finalized," she said. "How are you doing?" We talked for nearly an hour. She shared things about her childhood that confirmed my worst suspicions about Harold: the emotional and occasional physical abuse, the constant criticism, the impossible standards. "Dad broke something in all of us," she said. "James barely speaks to any of us now. Mom is a shell of who she could have been. And Eric. Eric always got the worst of it because he was the son Dad pinned all his hopes on." "That explains his behavior," I said, "but it doesn't excuse it." "No," Allison agreed. "It doesn't. For what it's worth, I think you made the right decision. I wish I had your courage with my own relationships." As we ended the call, she said something that stayed with me. "Dad didn't just hit you that night, Samantha. He showed you who our family really is. Maybe someday we'll all find the strength to break free like you did." Her words crystallized something I had been feeling but couldn't articulate. In that terrible moment, when Harold's hand connected with my face, when blood dripped onto marble floors, and Eric told me to apologize or leave, the illusion of the family I had married into had shattered. And in that shattering was a terrible gift. The truth, painful but necessary for healing. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I had established a new rhythm to my life. My position as senior creative director at the Columbus agency was challenging and fulfilling. I had made new friends through a local arts collective and reconnected with old ones from before my marriage. My apartment, once Spartan and temporary feeling, had become a true home filled with color and art and plants, all things that expressed my personality in ways I had subdued during my marriage. Therapy continued to be a cornerstone of my healing process. Dr. Lawson and I had moved beyond the immediate trauma of Harold's assault and Eric's betrayal to examining deeper patterns in my life. My tendency to accommodate others at my own expense, my difficulty setting and maintaining boundaries, my fear of conflict that had led me to swallow my truth too many times. "Confrontation doesn't have to be combative," Dr. Lawson reminded me during one session. "It can be clarifying. Sometimes we need to face difficult truths head-on to fully process and move beyond them." It was this conversation that was on my mind when I received an unexpected email from Eric, the first direct communication we'd had in months. The subject line was simple: "Can we talk?" The message was brief and surprisingly humble. "I've been doing a lot of thinking and work on myself. There are things I need to say to you, not to try to win you back or change your mind about the divorce, but because I owe you these words. Would you be willing to meet your terms, your location, whatever would make you comfortable?" I sat with the email for several days, discussing it with Dr. Lawson and my closest friends. Part of me wanted to delete it and continue forward, without reopening wounds that were finally healing. But another part recognized that there might be value in closure, in hearing what Eric had to say, now that time and distance had created space for reflection. After careful consideration, I replied, suggesting a meeting at a public park near my apartment during daylight hours. Eric agreed immediately. The day of our meeting was crisp and clear, early autumn painting the trees in gold and crimson. I arrived early, choosing a bench with a good view of the surrounding area, an instinct for self-protection that had become second nature since that night. Eric approached slowly, giving me plenty of time to see him coming. He looked different, thinner, more serious, but also somehow more present in himself. He was dressed simply in jeans and a sweater, none of the designer labels Harold had always insisted were necessary for making the right impression. "Thank you for meeting me," he said, remaining standing, until I gestured for him to sit at the opposite end of the bench. "You look well." "I am well," I replied, surprised to find it was true. "What did you want to talk about, Eric?" He took a deep breath. "First, I want to apologize. Really apologize, not excuse or justify or minimize what happened. What my father did was assault, plain and simple. And what I did, or failed to do, was unforgivable. You deserved a husband who would protect you, stand by you, choose you. I failed completely in that moment and in many moments leading up to it." His words were clearly rehearsed but seemed sincere. I nodded, acknowledging his apology without accepting it yet. "Go on." "After you left, after the divorce, I started therapy. Not couples therapy, obviously, but individual. It's been hard. Harder than anything I've ever done. Looking at my relationship with my father, seeing the patterns of abuse, I normalized recognizing how I brought that dysfunction into our marriage." He looked down at his hands. "My therapist helped me see that I've spent my entire life seeking Dad's approval, even when it meant betraying my own values or hurting people I love. What happened at his birthday party wasn't isolated. It was the culmination of a lifetime of choosing him over everything and everyone else." There was something different about Eric's demeanor, a groundedness, an ownership of his words that had been missing before. He wasn't looking to me for reassurance or validation, as he would have in the past. "What about Harold?" I asked, my heart rate increasing slightly, just saying his name. "Are you still in contact with him?" Eric's expression hardened slightly. "Limited contact. After months of therapy, I finally confronted him about his behavior, not just toward you, but throughout my childhood. It didn't go well. He refused to acknowledge any wrongdoing, called me ungrateful, threatened to cut me out of his will." "And did that threat work?" "As it always has before." "No," Eric said quietly. "For the first time in my life, I stood my ground. I told him I didn't want his money, if it came with control and abuse. I told him what he did to you was criminal assault, and that I would never forgive myself for not protecting you." I studied his face, looking for signs of the people-pleasing, conflict-avoidant Eric I had known. Instead, I saw someone who had begun the difficult work of reckoning with painful truths. "What happened then?" I asked. "He disowned me," Eric said, with a hint of bitter laughter. "Literally said I was no longer his son. I lost my position at Richardson Financial the next day. Turns out Dad had more influence there than I realized. I'm working at a smaller firm now, making less money, but doing work I actually believe in. Part of me, a small, still wounded part, felt vindicated hearing that Harold had faced at least some consequences for his behavior, even if indirectly. But mostly I felt sad for the generations of damage this man had inflicted on his family. And your mother? Siblings. Mom is still with him, still making excuses. Allison and I have gotten closer. She's been my biggest support through all this. James actually came out, officially introduced us to his long-term boyfriend. Dad refused to acknowledge it, of course. We talked for nearly 2 hours, the conversation flowing more easily as time passed. Eric shared his ongoing therapy insights, his attempts to rebuild relationships damaged by his enabling of Harold, his struggle to form an identity separate from his father's expectations. I shared some of my own journey, the career success I was achieving without Eric's connections, the freedom I felt in making decisions solely for myself, the slow rebuilding of trust in my own judgment. I want you to know, Eric said as our conversation wound down, that I don't expect anything from you. I'm not asking for reconciliation or even forgiveness. I just needed you to hear that I know how badly I failed you and that I'm trying to become someone who would never make that mistake again. I considered his words carefully. Thank you for saying that. I don't know if I can ever fully forgive what happened, but I appreciate your acknowledgement of it. And I'm genuinely glad you're doing the work to break the cycle. As we prepared to part ways, Eric hesitated. There's one more thing. Dad is facing some legal troubles, fraud allegations related to the dealerships. It's all very quiet right now, but there's a federal investigation. His empire might be built on sand. I absorbed this information, feeling neither joy nor sorrow at Harold's potential downfall. I hope justice is served, whatever that looks like. We said goodbye, with an awkward but civil handshake. As I watched Eric walk away, I felt a sense of completion, of a chapter truly closing. Whatever path Eric was on now, whether toward genuine change or another form of self-deception, it was no longer intertwined with mine. In the weeks that followed our meeting, I reflected on how far I had come from that bloody-lipped woman fleeing a mansion in the night. The confrontation with Eric had been clarifying, just as Dr. Lawson suggested it might be. It hadn't changed the past or erased the hurt, but it had confirmed that my decision to leave had been the right one, not just for my safety, but for my soul. My life continued to expand in ways it couldn't have within the constraints of my marriage. I took a photography class, something I had always wanted to do, but that Eric had dismissed as not practical. I traveled alone to New Mexico for a design conference, extending my stay to explore Santa Fe's art scene. I went on a few dates, nothing serious yet, but each one an affirmation that I could trust myself to recognize respect and kindness. At work, I led a campaign for a domestic violence awareness organization, channeling my personal experience into creating materials that might help others recognize warning signs I had missed. The campaign won a national award, and more importantly, increased calls to the organization's helpline by 30%. 7 months after my meeting with Eric, I received a clipping from Allison, a small newspaper article announcing federal charges against Harold Carson for tax fraud and financial misrepresentation. The accompanying photo showed Harold leaving a courthouse looking suddenly old and diminished without his usual trappings of power. I felt no satisfaction seeing this, only a quiet confirmation that appearances often hide deeper truths. Harold's carefully constructed image of success and respectability had concealed corruption, just as his public charm had masked private violence. Around this time, I also reconnected with Michael, a graphic designer I had known professionally for years. What began as collaboration on a project evolved into friendship and eventually cautious romance. Unlike Eric, Michael had no interest in controlling or changing me. He listened when I spoke, respected my boundaries without question, and showed consistent kindness not just to me, but to service workers, colleagues, and strangers. When I eventually shared the story of my marriage and its ending, Michael's response was simple and perfect. "I'm so sorry that happened to you, and I'm so impressed by your courage in leaving. Thank you for trusting me with your story." With Michael, I learned that love doesn't require diminishment or compromise of core values. It doesn't demand silence in the face of wrong. It doesn't place conditions on protection and support. These were lessons hard-won through pain but invaluable in their clarity. 1 year after the divorce, I received a letter from Eric. He was moving across the country for a fresh start, he wrote. His final confrontation with Harold had led to complete estrangement from both parents, though he remained close with his siblings. He was continuing therapy and beginning to volunteer with a men's group focused on breaking cycles of violence. "I will always regret that night, and all the ways I failed you leading up to it," he wrote. "But I want you to know that your courage in walking away ultimately forced me to face truths I might otherwise have avoided my entire life. I hope you are finding happiness and peace." I folded the letter carefully and placed it in a box with other mementos from that chapter of my life. Not displayed or dwelled upon, but preserved as part of the journey that had shaped me. Whatever Eric's path forward, I genuinely hoped he would find the strength to fully break free from Harold's toxic influence. My own path was clearer now, illuminated by hard-won wisdom and a deep commitment to honoring my own worth. The woman who had once apologized for existing too loudly in Harold Carson's world had found her voice, her boundaries, and her power, and she wasn't giving them up ever again. 2 years after that fateful night at Harold's birthday party, I stood in the center of a gallery, surrounded by my photography. The exhibition, titled "Aftermath Portraits of Resilience," featured women who had survived domestic violence, captured not as victims, but as warriors, their strength, dignity, and humanity on full display. The project had begun as personal therapy, a way to process my own experience through art. It had evolved into something much larger, with support from advocacy organizations and grants from arts foundations. Each portrait was accompanied by a brief narrative, the women's stories told in their own words. My own photo and story were included, no longer something I felt compelled to hide or minimize. "This is extraordinary work," Samantha said, Dr. Lawson, who had come to the opening night reception. Over the past 2 years, our relationship had evolved from therapist-patient to something closer to mentorship and eventually friendship as I completed my formal therapy. "How does it feel to see it all come together?" "Surreal," I admitted, looking around at the crowded gallery. 2 years ago, I couldn't imagine standing here. I was just trying to survive each day. "And now you're thriving," she said warmly. "That's the journey." Indeed, my life had transformed in ways I could never have predicted on that night. I fled Harold's mansion with blood on my face. My career had flourished. I was now creative director at one of the city's top agencies. My work focused primarily on campaigns for social justice organizations and nonprofits. The Domestic Violence Awareness Campaign had led to similar projects, allowing me to align my professional skills with causes I believed in deeply. My relationship with Michael had deepened, gradually built on a foundation of mutual respect and genuine partnership. He had moved in 6 months ago, and our home was a warm, creative space where both of us could pursue our passions without judgment or control. Michael's unwavering support of my exhibition project, from helping me lug equipment to shoots to listening as I processed the emotional weight of the women's stories, had confirmed what I now knew a healthy relationship looked like. As for the Carsons, I had limited knowledge of their current circumstances. Allison and I maintained occasional contact, mostly through social media, and rare phone calls. Through her, I learned that Harold had eventually pleaded guilty to reduced charges of tax evasion, receiving a substantial fine and probation rather than prison time. His business empire had crumbled, most of the dealerships sold to cover legal costs and penalties. The mighty Harold Carson was now living in a much reduced state, his influence and fortune diminished. Eric had indeed moved across the country, settling in Oregon, where he worked for an environmental finance firm. According to Allison, he continued therapy and had become involved in mentoring boys from difficult home situations. He was dating someone new, a relationship that seemed healthier than ours had been. I wished him well from a distance, our direct contact limited to occasional email updates. Diana had finally left Harold after 43 years of marriage, a development that had shocked everyone, except perhaps Dr. Lawson, who had observed that major status changes often create windows for breaking long-established patterns. When Harold lost his money and standing, he also lost his primary tools of control, she had explained. Diana could finally see a way out. These fragments of information about the Carsons came to me like dispatches from another life, one that seemed increasingly distant as I built my new reality. The physical scars from that night had faded completely. The split lip healed, the bruise disappeared, but the emotional lessons remained integrated into who I had become. Samantha Michael approached, accompanied by a reporter from the local arts magazine. Sorry to interrupt, but Elise wanted to ask you a few questions about the exhibition if you have time. After the interview, Michael and I circulated through the gallery greeting guests and answering questions about the project. The response was overwhelmingly positive, with several attendees sharing their own experiences with relationship violence, many for the first time. Your work has created a safe space for these conversations, observed Carmen, the director of a local women's shelter, who had helped connect me with many of the portrait subjects. That's a rare and valuable gift. Later that evening, as the crowd thinned and the event wound down, I found myself alone in front of my self-portrait. The photograph showed me in profile face, turned slightly toward the camera, the gallery, lighting, highlighting the determination in my expression. The accompanying text was simple. I left with nothing but my dignity. It turned out that was everything I needed to rebuild. Looking at that image, I reflected on the journey of the past 2 years. The pain, the healing, the growth, the rebuilding. I thought about all I had learned, lessons I wished I had understood sooner, but was grateful to know now. I had learned that love should never require you to make yourself smaller, to silence your voice, or to accept disrespect. I had learned that family systems can be toxic and that loyalty to others should never supersede loyalty to your own well-being and values. I had learned that leaving is sometimes the most powerful act of self-love possible. Most importantly, I had learned that healing isn't a destination, but a process, one that continues to unfold in unexpected ways. The broken pieces of my former life hadn't simply been repaired. They had been transformed into something new and stronger, like the Japanese art of kintsugi, where broken pottery is mended with gold, the cracks becoming the most beautiful part of the piece. Ready to head home? Michael asked, approaching with my coat. You must be exhausted. Actually, I feel energized, I said, smiling at him. But yes, let's go home. As we walked out into the cool night air, I thought about the concept of home, not just the physical space Michael and I shared, but the internal home I had built within myself. A place of safety, truth, and self-acceptance that no one could ever take from me again. The woman who had once apologized for accidentally spilling wine now moved through the world with quiet confidence, helping others find their voice while continuing to strengthen her own. The journey hadn't been easy, and there had been days when the pain seemed too much to bear. But standing on the other side of that pain, I could see how it had transformed me, how choosing myself hadn't been selfish, but necessary and ultimately healing. "What are you thinking about?" Michael asked as we drove home. "About choices," I said, "and how sometimes the hardest ones lead us exactly where we need to go." He reached for my hand across the console, understanding in his touch. No further explanation needed. That night, before falling asleep, I thought about the thousands of women who might be experiencing their own version of that terrible moment, the raised hand, the blood, the impossible choice. I hoped some of them might see my exhibition, read my story, and recognize that walking away doesn't mean giving up. Sometimes it means saving yourself. And in saving yourself, you create the possibility for a life more authentic and fulfilling than the one you left behind. A life built not on compromises and fear, but on truth and self-worth. A life where spilled wine is just spilled wine. A minor accident, not a catalyst for violence. A life where you are valued, respected, and free. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of the most difficult chapters of my life. If my story resonated with you in any way, please consider sharing it with someone who might need to hear these words. Remember that everyone deserves relationships free from violence and control. I would love to know your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had to make a difficult choice that ultimately led to growth? What helped you find the courage to choose yourself? Please like this video and subscribe for more stories of resilience and healing. Until next time, be kind to yourselves and to each other.